Thank you for listening to the Red Eye podcast. You guys are why we do this. We love the stories that you have, and we love telling you the stories that people share with us. To help us reach more people and get the podcast really out there, we would really appreciate it if you left a review. It just helps our podcast be a little bit more visible. Thank you. The stories which we bring you each week arrive at the Red Eye in many different forms. They're shared in galleys at 38,000 feet or in bars on layovers. They drop into our emails and messages, or they're passed to us by friends over coffee or wine. But this week's story was a first, because this one was given to our writer in the side room of her local emergency department by a surgeon, just as he was carrying out a procedure on her son. Yeah, they were all there. The boy, wide awake but under local anaesthetic, with a tube being threaded through the front of his chest to release trapped air. There's blood, there's suction, and that strange mix of calm and quiet panic that always seems to live in hospital rooms. And somehow, as the surgeon worked, the subject of flying came up. Something about how our writer had been in New York on a layover when she got the phone call from home. The call from her daughter saying, "Don't panic, Mum, but Lewis can't breathe and he's having chest pains." Yeah, it was the sort of phone call that any flying parent dreads getting when you're thousands of miles away and your nearest and dearest are in trouble. Well, it turned out that the poor lad had suffered something called a spontaneous pneumothorax, a collapsed lung in plain English, but we'll explain more about that later. And here's where the story came in. The surgeon, still holding the scalpel mid-procedure, blood literally running down her son's chest, suddenly paused, looked up and said, "I don't suppose you were on that famous flight where—" Now, we can't tell you the rest of what he said just yet because, well, that would be a spoiler. But no, our writer wasn't on that flight. But she did indeed go home and look it up. And it turns out that there really was a flight where someone suffered exactly the same thing as what her son had just had. And that is the story we're bringing you today. Based entirely on true events, as reported at the time, but with our usual fictional twist, this is the story of how one ordinary flight became a life or death operation in the sky. Doors to armed and cross-check. Come fly the Red Eye! Whoa! Welcome aboard the Red Eye. Hong Kong, 1995. Paula stood up and ran a quick mental checklist of her body. Arms, working. Legs, shaky but steady. Breathing. A bit fast, but okay. Are you okay, Paula? Paula's ears were ringing inside her helmet. She blinked, trying to steady her focus. Her heart was hammering. Her hands were trembling. Everything felt muffled and far away, like she was underwater, but her friend's voice managed to break through. Paula! He was right in front of her now, looking straight into her eyes. Paula gave her head a small shake to relieve the ringing, and then nodded. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just a bit bruised, I think." She rubbed her right forearm. It felt tender to touch, but she managed to wiggle her fingers, so that was a good sign, wasn't it? Nothing broken. "Are you sure?" His face was scrunched up in concern. Behind him, the motorbike from which they'd both just fallen lay seemingly unharmed by the accident. "What happened?" He shrugged and leaned down to pick it up. "I went to avoid something in the road and the wheel slipped out. Oh, thank God we weren't going fast." Ahead of them, the traffic crawled slowly towards the airport. People were looking out of their windows at them. Curious faces, probably wondering why the two foreigners were stood at the side of the four-lane road. "Are you up to getting back on?" Paula hesitated. The logical part of her brain wanted to say no, to jump in one of the countless taxis that were passing. But she looked at her watch. It was less than an hour before boarding. They'd already been running late. And that was why they'd come by bike in the first place, so they could weave their way through the predictable Hong Kong traffic. Oh, poor Margaret would be frantic waiting for her, worrying that she wouldn't make the flight. Yeah, she said finally, forcing a grin. I'm good. Let's just go. He raised an eyebrow. Are you sure? Positive. One hour later, boarding. Oh, I don't suppose you can lift my bag up there for me, Paula asked her friend reluctantly. She wasn't one to moan or make a big deal of things, but her arm was really quite sore. Are you sure you're okay? Margaret frowned. I told you, I'm fine, Paula smiled reassuringly, slipping across the row of seats to 53K. It's just bruised. Well, if you say so, Margaret said, stowing both their bags overhead and taking the seat next to her. Settled, they caught up on the last few days in Hong Kong, and before long, the plane was rumbling down the runway and taking off for London. Paula watched the lights shrink away beneath them, tried to pick out the boats in the harbour, the cargo ships in the sea, anything to take her mind off the throbbing in her arm. The seatbelt signs pinged off, and Margaret pulled down her table ready for the drink service. What are we having then? She asked chirpily as the trolley rolled towards them. Gin? A little wine? She turned to Paula with a cheeky grin on her face, and it slipped straight back off. Paula sat clutching her arm, pain written on her face in big, bold, capital letters. How about some painkillers washed down with a double gin? Margaret said quickly, reaching into her handbag for some paracetamol. Paula managed a small laugh. That sounds great, she said, looking at the 2 small pills that her friend put on her table. She rubbed her arm and moved her fingers just to reconfirm what she knew. It was simply bruised. Nothing more. So why did it hurt so damn much? Before long, it was unbearable. Before the tablets had had time to work, Margaret could see that her friend was in trouble. She used her napkin to pat the sweat from Paula's forehead and pressed her call bell. I think my friend needs some help, she said when the flight attendant arrived. She had a motorcycle accident on the way to the airport and she's really hurt her arm. In the galley, the flight attendant examined Paula's arm. He wasn't sure. He called his colleague over and asked for a second opinion. The arm looked a bit swollen and the lady's pain was obvious, but he was better with feints than injuries. They were much more common on board. They pondered what to do. As they stood there, a third flight attendant came into the galley, followed by a middle-aged man in an open-neck shirt and a younger, sharper-dressed man with wire-rimmed glasses. These 2 gentlemen are doctors, she said, and the 3 crew stepped back, relieved to let the experts take over. It turned out that there were 2 doctors sat near to where Paula was sitting that day. Dr. Wong, a physician from Hong Kong, and Professor Angus Wallace, Chief of Orthopaedics from Queen's Medical Centre in Nottingham, England. The pair, working together, quickly fixed her up, gave her something for the pain and sent her back to her seat. They were both sure that her arm wasn't broken, and Paula had felt silly as they examined it and set it in a soft splint. Oh, what a fuss she was making. But for someone who actively avoided being the centre of attention and didn't go to the doctors for anything really, she had to admit that she had been close to her pain threshold. Now, though, settled back into her seat and some stronger painkillers in her system, she was starting to feel a little bit better. Although, did the pain seem to be spreading to her chest a bit? She stared hard out of the window. If she didn't think about it, then maybe it would just go away. The sky map said they were over the Bay of Bengal, and below her she could see the curvature of the land and make out the white peaks of the waves in the bay. Next to her, Margaret was engrossed in the film that was showing on the screen at the front, her headphones on and a small smile on her face. Paula concentrated harder, trying to take herself away from the pain, imagining that she was down there, riding those waves on a boat like a North Sea fisherman back home in Scotland. But the pain wasn't going. It was getting worse. And whether it was from that or something else, now she was struggling to breathe. Oh, she just couldn't seem to get a full breath in. Panic began to flood her, and she tapped Margaret's leg just lightly. Her friend turned and took one look at her, and then the chaos began. Dr. Wong and Professor Wallace didn't take long to diagnose what was happening. From just a few observations, and already knowing the history of the accident, they both knew what was happening, and exactly what needed to be done. Dr. Wallace looked at Paula, who was by now pale and sweating, her breath short and shallow. "I'm very sorry," he said with calm urgency, "but I'm going to have to operate." The two doctors were both in agreement that what Paula Dixon was experiencing was a spontaneous pneumothorax. She hadn't just hurt her arm in the accident. She wasn't just bruised. No. A fractured rib had likely punctured her pleura, the thin membrane surrounding the lung, and that was now allowing air to leak into the chest cavity. Every breath she took was forcing more air into that space, gradually collapsing her right lung and beginning to shift pressure onto the other. If they didn't act soon, her heart would be next. Both doctors knew that what they were looking at could quickly become fatal if they didn't act fast. Paula Dixon needed a chest drain put in to let the air out, and they'd need to do it with whatever they could get their hands on. "The captain says the closest airfield for a diversion is Delhi, Professor," said the flight manager, laying out the onboard medical kit on the galley side. "Would you like us to head there?" Professor Wallace shook his head. "No," he said, scanning down the list of contents that came with the kit. "We need to stabilise her first. If we start descending too quickly, the changing cabin pressure could make things worse. Tell the captain to maintain altitude for now," he said, with the quiet analytical calm of a man accustomed to working under pressure. The manager gave a nod to the crew member who was hovering close by, the one who had been assigned to communicate with the pilots, and she picked up the phone to pass the message on. The two doctors opened the pouches of the kit. They quickly pulled out some scissors, anaesthetic, and a scalpel, laying them on the side. In another part, they found gloves and aprons, gauze and dressings. "Tubing," one of them said quietly to themselves, pulling out a catheter bag and using the scissors to snip off the bag part, laying the plastic tubing down next to the other things. "That will do, but," he said, looking thoughtful. He turned to the manager. "Do you have some wire?" In the hospital, they would use wire to stiffen the silicone tube for insertion into the chest and then pull it out after, but there didn't seem to be anything in here. The manager thought for a second and then made a suggestion in half-seriousness. "A coat hanger?" "Perfect. Oh, and I need something to sterilise things." The manager thought quickly, using her knowledge of everything they had to come up with an improvised solution to everything they didn't have. And before long, the last row of the 747 was turned into an operating theatre. An operating theatre at 38,000 feet. Paula was terrified as she lay across the three seats, trying desperately to breathe against the excruciating pain. She wished that the oxygen mask that was over her face had more than just oxygen coming through it, that they could just knock her out or put her into a peaceful sleep while they did whatever they needed to do. Through the back of the seats, Margaret held her hand, and around them the cabin crew held up blankets to shield the scene from the cabin. She tried not to watch as they worked. She knew that the procedure was necessary, but while the initial incision had been kind of bearable, when she saw the doctor coming in with a set of cutlery to hold it open, well, she almost laughed. If she hadn't felt so giddy, she might well have done. The flight manager watched on, knowing that she'd never see anything like this done on board again. That having a real live operation carried out in the economy cabin was a story that would hold counsel around the dinner table for years. "So was the equipment sterile?" they would ask. "Yes," she would reply. "They sterilized it in the brandy from first class." "But did they have any instruments?" was a question that was sure to come up. "Yes, they had a scalpel and a knife and fork," she would say, and watch them gawp. And she would tell them what she had seen. The knife and fork. The coat hanger straightened out and threaded through the tube. The one-way valve made from a half-empty bottle of Evian. And then how they had taped everything into place with a roll of repair tape. Paula squeezed Margaret's hand as the tube was threaded through and into her chest cavity. The pain was somehow strangely bearable, though. Not because it didn't hurt, because it certainly did, but because another sensation took over her senses almost immediately. As the tubing reached the cavity and the wire was extracted, she could actually feel her lung reinflating back into its space. She could feel the air that she breathed in going into her lung, breathing in and out as it had always done. And that organ, which had been inside her body doing its thing for all these years without an ounce of appreciation, was suddenly back in action. And as the air came back, so did her smile. "Oh, I can breathe," she said, feeling suddenly emotional, catching the strong smell of brandy as she pulled the oxygen mask aside to test the cabin air. She dared to glance down at the tubing that was sticking out of her chest like an appendage, taped to it with what looked like sellotape. "You look like a human juice box," Margaret laughed, peering down at her over the seatback, her eyes watering with relief. "Thanks," Paula laughed, craning her neck to follow the tubing down towards the floor, wondering where it led. She was surprised to see that it ended in a half-empty bottle of Evian water that was gently bubbling away as the air escaped into it. "Is that all coming out of my chest?" she asked the doctor, who was noting something down on a form. Professor Wallace looked up and nodded, his face still serious as Dr. Wong took her blood pressure for the umpteenth time. "You were very lucky, Miss Dixon," he said. "Very lucky indeed." Professor Wallace looked back down at the medical observation sheet he was filling in. He felt an unfamiliar wobble as the reality of what they had just done hit home. He hadn't fit a chest drain for years. It wasn't either of their speciality fields. Yes, he had stayed calm. That was what he was trained to do, but he was astute enough to know that they had been working against the odds, with equipment that was highly irregular, and in an environment that he wasn't an expert of. He scoffed out loud as he imagined telling his peers that he had used a knife and fork and a coat hanger to operate, and that it had all been sterilized in a very nice bottle of brandy. The flight manager appeared behind them, wringing her hands together in a mix of worry and relief, a smile of gratitude on her face. "Gentlemen, can I offer you both something to drink?" Professor Wallace pictured what remained of the very nice bottle of brandy they'd used and left on the galley side. Yes, he thought, that would do to take the edge off. That would do nicely, but not quite yet. Not until they had safely landed. "9 hours later. It was quite remarkable, Paula thought as she sat herself up, watching through her window as the sun rose over the horizon. How dire her situation had been just a few hours ago, and how perfectly normal she felt now. Well, apart from the burning pain in her chest, the aching in her arm and the tube in her chest. But somehow, all of that was dulled by the overwhelming sense of gratitude that she felt to everyone who'd come to help her. The breakfast trolley pulled alongside, the welcome smell of coffee overpowering the stench of brandy that still lingered in the air. "Would you like breakfast?" the girl asked cautiously. "Oh, yes, please," replied Paula, sitting herself up. "I really am quite hungry," she said, thinking once again just how remarkable that was. She looked at the doctor who was sat just in front of her. "Am I okay to have something?" He nodded kindly. "Of course." The plane had continued its flight all the way to London. That was how certain they were that she was okay. But as they taxied to the gate, she had an inkling that it wasn't quite over. Not yet. The paramedics boarded and relieved the two doctors of their watch. They arrived with a stretcher, but Paula insisted on walking, and with her arm in its splint and her chest bandaged beneath her shirt, she did just that. Steady as you like, down the narrow aisle, out into the soft grey light of a London morning. She made a full recovery, later saying that she remembered almost nothing of the procedure, just the calm voices, the strange heat in her chest, and the sound of someone telling her to breathe. Just breathe. For her, the whole thing seemed to have unfolded in a dream. For Wallace and Wong, it became the story of a lifetime. And according to reports, Professor Wallace did indeed enjoy the rest of that brandy. The tale made its way into newspapers around the world and into medical journals as a case study in improvisation under pressure. Aviation doctors still talk about it today, and thoracic surgeons are apparently still talking about it in emergency rooms. Not because it's a common occurrence, because thankfully it isn't, but because it's such a perfect example of what happens when skill, composure, and simple thinking outside of the box came together in the most unlikely of circumstances. It's crazy to think that thousands of planes take off every single day without a surgeon on board. But thankfully for Paula Dixon, there was a surgeon on Flight 32. Without him and without the quick-thinking cabin crew, the outcome could have been very, very different. Professor Wallace has since retired, but we found another incredibly interesting aviation story related to him and how he has affected safety demonstrations and safety procedures for the rest of time. Professor Wallace was working at Queen's Medical Centre the night a plane crashed on the M1 near the Leicestershire village of Kegworth in 1989. His research on the injuries sustained by the passengers, 47 of whom sadly died, led to the adoption of the brace position for passengers in the UK. Professor Wallace is probably responsible for lives being saved even now. So we'd like to thank Professor Angus Wallace, not just for what he did for Paula Dixon, but what he did for all of us. And as a side note, Kaylee's son is thankfully recovering well after a pretty scary time. Sending you lots of love, Lewis. And thanks for giving your mum the opportunity to find another incredible story.
The Red Eye podcast is written by Kaylee Kay. Narrated and produced by me, Ali Murphy. These stories are based on true events, but certain details, characters, and timelines have been altered to protect the innocent. Visit our website, theredeyepod.com, to subscribe to our newsletter and to find out details on how you can contribute your story for us to turn into an episode. If you enjoyed listening to our stories, please like, subscribe, and review. Thank you.
Our author, Kaylee Kay, does an incredible job of taking these true stories and turning them into fun little episodes for the Red Eye podcast. But did you know she's already written 6 novels, and they are amazing? So if you want to read those, visit Amazon and search for Kaylee Kay, and I'll put a link in the show notes too.